there is growing fallout over revelations of those missing documents from the Jeffrey Epstein files, including interviews with a woman who leveled accusations against Donald Trump. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal now both have confirmed reporting by NPR and MS Now that the Department of Justice has withheld dozens of pages of FBI memos and notes of interviews with a woman who accused Epstein and Trump of sexually assaulting her as a minor. Records confirm the woman had 4 interviews with investigators, but only documents from one of those meetings made it into the public release. The Epstein Files Transparency Act requires the DOJ, requires by law, to release most Epstein-related files and explicitly forbids withholding files to avoid embarrassing public figures. In a statement, the DOJ said it is reviewing files and, quote, should any document be found to have been improperly tagged in the review process and is responsive to the act, the department will, of course, publish it consistent with the law. MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin reports during the Epstein Files review process, the Justice Department was tracking the very type of document that now is missing. In a memo last month, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche ordered all department workers who were reviewing files to tag documents that include specific information. One of the types of documents Blanche required to be tagged by workers is called a 302. That is the form that the FBI uses to memorialize interviews, the same type of document that is missing from Donald Trump's accuser. President Trump has denied any wrongdoing in connection to Epstein. Meanwhile, former President Bill Clinton and his wife, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, are set to testify in a House investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. This morning, Hillary Clinton will give a deposition behind closed doors. Bill Clinton is scheduled to testify tomorrow. It comes after months of haggling between the couple's lawyers and leaders of the House Oversight Committee, which voted unanimously to issue a subpoena for their testimony back in July. Bill Clinton's ties to Epstein, including 4 flights on Epstein's jet in 2002 and 2003, as well as photos in the files released by the Justice Department, are central to the committee's interest. Hillary Clinton, however, did not travel with Epstein and had said she never even spoke with him and only met his associate Ghislaine Maxwell a handful of times. There is no evidence of wrongdoing on the part of either Clinton when it comes to Epstein Joe. So Hillary Clinton Joe deposed today, Bill Clinton deposed tomorrow. Hillary Clinton's name, yes, is in the Epstein files hundreds of times because Jeffrey Epstein clipped articles about the 2016 election and would send them to friends. Talked in one instance, told a friend he would have no luck setting up a meeting with Hillary Clinton because he didn't have a relationship with her, didn't know her well enough. So she is very, very tangentially related to the Epstein files.
Yeah, it's so remote in this whole issue that Jonathan Lemire, it really does just completely expose, totally expose Comer and the Republicans here, show what bad faith operators they've been in this so-called investigation, where you have with Hillary Clinton somebody that, again, hardly ever spoke to Jeffrey Epstein, never on his plane, had next to nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. She's being deposed today while the Justice Department clearly got caught in a cover-up by NPR, clearly got caught in a cover-up as reported by the New York Times, as reported by Murdoch's Wall Street Journal. And again, it's just a farce. The whole thing is a farce. If I were Hillary Clinton, and of course Hillary Clinton is much smarter than me, but if I would spend the whole time saying, I didn't know him. What do you think are in those files? What do you think are in their files with a young woman who was 13 years old who's accusing the president of doing X, Y, and Z? I mean, it is such a sham. And the fact that Todd Blanche is telling people to look for a certain sort of files that now have disappeared, now have not been released with the rest of the Epstein files, this whole thing looks like such a cover-up. And I will just say what we've been saying for 6 to 9 months now. If they have nothing to worry about, they should have released all the documents 9 months ago. This story would have been over 8 months ago. But they keep dragging it out. And Willie brings up a great point. I mean, here we have a scandal, just probably the biggest scandal of the entire Epstein files right now, the cover up by the Justice Department of these files that are that reveal testimony of like the most terrible things about Donald Trump. We don't know whether they're true or not. But they cover those up after the law orders that they be released. And at the same time, they're dragging Hillary Clinton into a deposition, and she had nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, the Department of Justice's claim of impartially handling the Epstein matter is undermined by the fact that at the Department of Justice's headquarters in Washington, there's a giant banner with Donald Trump's face on it. That's true, right there on Main Justice. And they are acting like it. As you said, Joe, as we talked about it in real time, every move DOJ has made, and that by extension, the Republican-led Congress, has only raised more questions about Trump's involvement with this matter, that there's something in there that he does not want out there, reflective of him or his friends or loved ones, whatever it might be. We don't totally know, and we don't know the claims here or if they're true or not. But we do know there's stuff missing, and the Department of Justice seems to be deliberately hiding it and playing, with the help of the Republican Congress, misdirection. One of the dumps of the Epstein files a few weeks ago was simply about Bill Clinton. It was so transparently political. And, Allie, that's where we are again today. An attempt to shift this focus on the Clintons, even though we know President Trump has privately expressed some concern about this, because by putting the spotlight on the Clintons and making them sit for these depositions, like, well, OK, why not President Trump? He even had more of a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. I know you're heading to Chappaqua in Westchester County, north of here, where the Clintons are. Talk to us what we should expect.
I think you're right to bring up the hypocrisy that this then raises, because it raises the question of, if you want to talk to former President Bill Clinton, which I think there's some valid questions to be asked. He appears in photos. Let's ask those questions. Why are you then not asking the same of President Trump? I've asked James Comer, the chairman of the Oversight Committee, that very question. He doesn't have a clear answer. In fact, he said, well, the president has talked many times on the record about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. OK, hasn't done that under oath to Congress. I think that's probably a valid conversation to have. And then I think there's also a fascinating dynamic of Hillary Clinton once again being forced to answer for her husband. That, I think, has a ton of gender dynamics that we won't get into before 7 in the morning. But I think there's also then the question of, if we are asking spouses to talk about what their husbands might have been privy to, why are we not also asking Melania Trump that question? She has correspondence that is in the Epstein files with Ghislaine Maxwell. That's just one example, right? So I think it does open the Oversight Committee and Republicans on that committee up to some valid questions. And I think you only further see the politics of this by the fact that last week, when the Oversight Committee went to New Albany, Ohio, to talk to Les Wexner, Comer and Republicans were not physically there. They sent lawyers themselves, and that happens in Congress, especially for depositions behind closed doors. Sometimes they want lawyers who are actually trained in doing cross-examination to do these kinds of depositions before and if they make something public. But for Comer now, going to this closed-door deposition in Chappaqua, why are you coming to this, but you didn't go to Les Wexner's deposition? I think that's one of the questions that I want to ask the chairman of the committee as well, especially as you consider what they're likely to get from this and then the Clintons' desire to make it public at some point.
Hillary Clinton will hold her own. No one has any doubt about that today. But, Allie, I'm curious, does the Justice Department just think that this will go away somehow? We watched Pam Bondi in that hearing last week or 2 weeks ago talking about the Dow being over 50,000, not acknowledging the survivors who were in the room, wouldn't even turn. He didn't have to say anything or apologize for legal reasons or whatever, but wouldn't acknowledge them. And yet they seem to want to turn the page on this, but the Oversight Committee's opening the wound again. This isn't going away. Why won't they just release all the files unless they've got something to hide?
And I think that's the question. And there's always been a skepticism in bipartisan fashion from members of Congress who wanted to compel the release of these files in the first place. There was the question of, OK, we can pass the law, but are they really going to comply? And it gets them into the territory of, how do you know what you're looking for if you don't exactly know what you're looking for? The benefit that the committee and, frankly, Kana and Massey, who operate outside of it but are very much closely related to it, is that they have the survivors to help hold DOJ accountable. The survivors know the statements that they gave to the FBI at various points. The survivors also know who these men were that were part of their abuse. And that is how the committee and other relevant lawmakers are going to be able to continue to hold DOJ's feet to the fire by saying, we know that this particular document should be in there. Why is it not in there? We know that it's missing. How do we get it? But the enforcement mechanism was always the problem with the law. And it's also the problem that the Oversight Committee faces, because as multiple members have reminded me, there is a subpoena that they issued last summer to DOJ and AG Pam Bondi for these very documents. If she's not complying with the law that President Trump signed, why is she going to comply with a committee that is not asking her or forcing her to comply? But they are enforcing subpoenas against the Clintons, just not enforcing it against the Attorney General, at least not yet.
Well, I mean, it is really, it's incredible. And it goes to what I said here last week. We have two systems of justice in America, and it's not a system for the rich and a system for the poor. It's a system for Republicans and a system for Democrats under this Justice Department. Think about it. Larry Summers faces the music out of, leaving Harvard. Bob Kerrey, a former United States Senator, off a board in Nebraska. Look what happened to Labor Party members, again, center-left, over in Britain, out of a job. And yet conservatives that are all over these documents, whether you're talking about Howard Lutnick, whether you're talking about Donald Trump, whether you're talking about one Republican after another who has been in Donald Trump's orbit, that was also in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit, there's absolutely, no justice. No justice. And again, going to Chappaqua? Wait. Why don't they just go to the Justice Department and talk to Pam Bondi, say, hey, you really probably should follow the law. This is making all of us look bad right now. Willie, I wanted to ask Jonathan Lemire really quickly, White House reaction. I know that there have been some that would actually admit concern to you inside the White House, but with the president's approval ratings in the 30s and these revelations coming out in the afternoon of the president's State of the Union address, again, the worst sort of allegations that you could have, and long-running allegations that obviously would turn the attention back to the president. What is the reaction inside of the White House? What are you picking up?
I mean, there's been frustration all along with how this has been handled. And that's sort of counterintuitive because so much of what DOJ is doing is at the direction, at least unspoken direction, perhaps, of the White House. But the president has said to people close to him in the last few months that he's been soured on how Attorney General Bondi has handled this. And then we see Bondi try to do a course correction to protect him. And that only seems to make it worse. But there's no doubt that they were upset with the timing of these revelations. It drowned out a State of the Union, which we talked about yesterday, probably wasn't going to move the needle much anyway. And as an aside, when was the last time a president delivered a State of the Union and then didn't go tour the country or to support those ideas or even appear in public? We never saw President Trump at all yesterday. Truly strange on the heels of a speech like that meant to reignite some momentum for his presidency. But they understand. They understand that this Epstein matter is much the president's frustration. He, since last summer, has urged it to go away. Remember when at first it was percolating on the right, Willie, with those the podcasts and stuff? And he's like, no, stop talking about it. Stop talking about it. A few did. Most didn't. And the story just simply won't get, to his great frustration, he can't shake this. And I haven't picked up any sense that there's like a legal concern here from the White House, but they know it's bad politically.
And we've been asking for many months why he's so desperate for this to go away, why he's so desperate to turn the page. It's not going to be turned because of stories like the one that came out yesterday. We'll have much more on this coming up later in the show.